Now I want to talk about a few bad candidate criteria that are obviously wrong or obviously have problems. And then we'll talk about the ones that I think are pretty much discussed seriously in philosophers of science and ones that are taken seriously. So the first is the claim, okay, pseudoscience is that which contradicts the most reliable knowledge about its subject matter that is currently available. This seems intuitively plausible, but one of the problems is what this would basically do is make things that were false be considered science, right? If it's considered by, because here's the thing, truth isn't decided by consensus, right? Previously in the past, the most reliable knowledge was that the Earth was flat, or that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun revolved around the Earth. And in that case, then what we would basically be saying is, arguing that the Earth isn't the center of the universe would be pseudoscience until it's later considered science. And I think, at least to me, there's something, I don't know, basically there's something unsatisfying about this, because basically what we're saying is just because it has the label pseudoscience doesn't mean it's false and doesn't mean it won't eventually later be considered science if we adopt this definition. So should this change over time, right? This is a question. Do we want our definition of pseudoscience to change, or do we want the science versus pseudoscience distinction to somehow be related to truth itself? That's an interesting question. Do we want it to be based on the theories, based on consensus, or based on what we assume actually is? The next one is it corresponds to what is true. And then this is where I'd say the thing I mentioned earlier, right? We can't necessarily restrict its methodology. If we assume that the scientific method is the way of finding truth, now we're doing philosophy. Now, claiming that the scientific method is the only or the best way to find truth is not a statement that can be investigated with the scientific method itself. So in that case, that claim would be self-defeating by this particular definition, and you would need to expand the definition of science to consider all possible angles. And you could just ask, well, how do we know that's true? Obviously not through science. And then here's Hansen's definition, which I think is really interesting. This is getting close. This is getting really close. This isn't Hansen's actual definition, but this is another example he gives, right? And he says it's part of a doctrine whose major proponents try to create the impression that it represents the most reliable knowledge on the subject matter. But the problem is everybody who is claiming to do science is going to try to make the impression that it represents the most reliable knowledge on its subject matter. So it's difficult to say that this is a good definition. Also, it moves us out of science and really into epistemology. How do we know that these sorts of things create truth? But I do think this is perhaps the most common everyday usage of the term, and I think if we refine this a little bit, we'll get a much better definition. A few more. First is time, just a historical definition, right? Things that are historically considered science are science, or that they're more likely to be considered science. There's something, that is something like astrology that was considered science but no longer is. This should raise some questions. There's something unsatisfying about this. I think we don't want it to just be time. We want it to have something to do with the quality of the theories themselves. So I'd say this idea of, okay, well, we've always considered this science. It's kind of tradition as opposed to having anything to do with the theories themselves. I think there's a good reason to be skeptical of this. Another one you could say is it's something that looks like science, but it's done with advancing a specific agenda. The problem with this is, first of all, it's difficult to know when this is the case. Like, are you really advancing an agenda, or are you trying to find truth and you just think that the evidence leads you to a different area based on either your experience or whatever? And how can you prove this? That's a difficult thing. The other thing I'll say is, all science is done with a specific agenda, and researchers themselves are biased. So it's difficult to say, how do you know when people are biased or unbiased? How would you be able to use this as a demarcating criteria for science and non-science? I say this because every scientist, even if the field of science is supposed to be free of value judgments, and the methodology of science is free from value judgments, every time a scientist does an experiment, he or she is making a value judgment in the sense that he or she thinks that this experiment is worth their time doing implicitly, because otherwise they would be doing something else with their life or doing some other experiment. So it's okay to say that scientific methodology should not have value judgments, and that's fine, but you can still acknowledge that scientists are always making value judgments, every single day and in what they're doing. I mean, when I do an experiment, I'm obviously at least thinking or hoping that this experiment is either going to help my career or is going to help human knowledge, some maybe very idealistic goal. And these are all value judgments as well. So would it be fair to say that my goal of seeking truth or my goal of doing something impactful is also advancing my own agenda? I think you could argue yes, and as a result, this doesn't really help us in my view. And the other thing some people will say is BS, basically. The difference between BS and like something something that's not BS, but otherwise would be considered false, is that BS is stuff that is communicated with the knowledge that it is BS. It's like, it's one thing to convince someone about something wrong that you think is true, but the idea of BS is like, it's not true, or it doesn't have the same case, and you're trying to get them to believe it or manipulate them in some particular way. So it's just knowledge of something being deliberately misleading. And I think this is interesting because it's helpful in the sense that, yes, obviously if people know something is false or wrong and they're convincing other people, that's clearly going to be pseudoscience. It doesn't, align with the very idealistic goals of science. But yet at the same time, I think people who are practicing things we traditionally think are pseudoscience, like say astrology or looking into the paranormal or the occult or whatever, many of them, I think it would be unfair to say that they're deliberately knowing that they're lying. I think many of these people do seem very authentic in at least believing that their claims are true. So I'm worried that this definition leaves out a very important set of criteria that we would want to include. And once again, how would we know that somebody is deliberately misleading? We pretty much have to go based on their word and other evidence around there.